The early spring sun filtered through lace curtains as Helen Morrison smoothed the papers on the kitchen table. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. She'd always imagined this moment would be comforting, a way to secure her daughter Rachel's future, to protect the home that had held generations of Morrison family memories. The ink bled softly into the signature line. Helen Marie Morrison. Just like that, the house was no longer hers. Rachel had insisted it was just a formality. "We'll all be living here anyway, Mom. It's just easier this way. Legally. It'll give me peace of mind, and you'll never have to worry about anything again." Helen had smiled, hiding the crack in her heart. She had always found comfort in control of her home, her garden, her routines. But after losing her husband, Gerald, 18 months prior, she'd felt adrift. Maybe, she thought, letting go would free her to feel held for once. Not by things, but by family. But the tide turned quickly. Within days of the deed transfer, Rachel's tone changed, the softness in her voice dulled. Calls of Mom became clipped commands. And then, Kurt arrived. Rachel's husband. Helen had never liked the man. There was a smugness in his eyes, a sort of calculating distance masked by politeness. They'd been married quickly and quietly during Gerald's final hospital stay. Helen had missed the wedding. Now Kurt entered her home like a man claiming territory. "We'll need the master for ourselves," he said the first night, tossing his leather duffel onto her late husband's side of the bed. "I've got sleep apnea. Rachel can't handle the couch again." Helen blinked, mouth slightly ajar. The master bedroom had been her sanctuary, filled with Gerald's scent, with decades of their shared life. But Rachel only nodded, eyes flicking away. The move was swift. Her clothes, her books, even Gerald's watch on the nightstand, all boxed up and wheeled into the smaller guest bedroom by Kurt's brawny arm and passive-aggressive smirk. Helen tried to protest, but Rachel just offered a tired smile and a vague, "Just until we settle in." Days turned to weeks. The guest room, once cozy, grew stifling. Then, Rachel's friend came to stay. Temporarily, she said. Helen was moved again, this time into a narrow hallway alcove fitted with a fold-out cot. Finally, the moment that broke her. She returned from the grocery store to find her bedding folded on top of an old trunk in the garage. "I figured we needed to make space for the baby," Rachel said, avoiding Helen's eyes. "The garage is warm enough this time of year." "You said you used to sleep in the car for stargazing, remember?" Helen felt like a ghost in her own life. Her home, once filled with the scents of lavender sachets, fresh-baked bread, and Gerald's aftershave, now smelled of drywall dust, motor oil, and damp cement. The garage had a single window, half-shuttered with cobwebs. She slept beside the rusting water heater. Her bedside table was a milk crate. The humiliation stung, but what hurt more was Rachel's detachment. Helen had raised her alone, sacrificed promotions and partners to give her daughter a world of possibility. And now, she watched that same daughter speak to her like an aging tenant. Kurt took charge of the house as if born to it, rearranging furniture, hosting loud poker nights, even changing the Wi-Fi password without telling her. "It's probably for the best," he quipped. "Older folks and tech don't mix." Helen's friends stopped visiting. Her bridge group dissolved under vague excuses. She started eating meals alone in the garage, afraid to disturb Kurt's moods. He was never overtly cruel, always veiled in sarcasm and smiles, but she felt the power dynamic shift. Rachel deferred to him in everything. Then came the moment that planted the first real seed of doubt in Helen's mind. She returned home early one afternoon and walked past the den, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Kurt was on the phone, whispering urgently. "Yes, the old woman signed it over. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Just give me a few more weeks to—" Helen didn't hear the rest. A floorboard creaked under her foot, and Kurt abruptly ended the call. He appeared in the hallway seconds later, smiling too wide. "Hey, Helen, everything okay?" She nodded dumbly and walked past him, the words echoing in her head. She doesn't suspect anything. That night, alone in the cold garage, Helen stared at the ceiling. Her breath fogged in the air. She thought of Gerald, what he'd make of all this. She remembered the day they moved into the house, the way he'd carried her over the threshold and whispered, "Ours. Forever." And now, was she nothing more than a guest here? No, not even that. A trespasser in a house that bore her name for 40 years. She pulled the deed papers from beneath her pillow, running her fingers along the notary stamp. Had she made the biggest mistake of her life? She folded them carefully, slid them back into their envelope, and whispered aloud, to no one, to everyone, "Something's wrong." And for the first time, she considered that what she gave in love might have been used to erase her. The nights in the garage were always the worst. Cold crept through the concrete floor no matter how many blankets Helen layered over herself. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was listening silence, the kind that made her ears strain for every sound above her. The house creaked differently now, as if it resented her presence. It had been 3 weeks since Helen overheard Kurt on the phone. Since then, she'd been alert, watching, listening. And what she saw confirmed her gnawing suspicion. Something was terribly wrong inside her home. It began with the drawer in the upstairs hallway, the one that had once held batteries and menus from local takeout spots. She noticed it one morning while cleaning. It was locked. She hadn't seen it locked in decades, and she certainly hadn't locked it. The keyhole was fresh, recently replaced. A week later, the small safe in Gerald's study, once used to hold insurance documents and old family photos, was gone entirely. The bookshelves that once housed dusty encyclopedias had been replaced by modern minimalist shelves, empty ones. She confronted Rachel casually over breakfast. "Did you reorganize the study?" Rachel didn't look up from her phone. Kurt thought it looked cluttered. "We're updating the place, Mom." But when Helen tried to follow up with, "Where's the safe?" Rachel flinched. Kurt moved it. Somewhere more secure. Why? That twitch, that half-second of panic, said more than words. Helen waited until everyone was asleep before creeping upstairs that night, stepping lightly on the parts of the floor that didn't groan. She tiptoed to the hallway drawer, pulled gently, still locked. Then she turned toward Rachel's room, only to freeze in place. Low voices, arguing, whispered, urgent. "You said it was buried," Rachel's voice, clipped and strained. "I said no one would find it." "Not unless someone's digging," Kurt hissed. "I told you not to panic." "You shouldn't have touched the will, Kurt. What if she remembers? What if?" The sound of footsteps approaching the door sent Helen darting back to the shadows. She barely breathed as she watched Rachel peek into the hallway, glance around, then quietly close the bedroom door again. Down in the garage, Helen replayed the words. The will? She remembers? Her memories spun like autumn leaves in wind. Years ago, when Gerald had been diagnosed with cancer, they'd gone over the will together, in detail. She had been listed as sole owner of the house. They even joked about what Rachel might do with it once they were gone. But now she couldn't find a copy anywhere. The only one she'd had was in that safe. Her unease sharpened when strangers began appearing at the house after dark. 3 times that week, Helen saw sleek black cars pull up the driveway. Men in tailored coats and tinted glasses emerged, each carrying a leather briefcase. None stayed long. Each was ushered into Gerald's old study, each left through the back door. Helen asked about it once, during dinner. "Friends of Kurt's," Rachel said with a forced smile. "Investment stuff?" "Kurt's never worked in investments." Rachel's fork froze midair. "You don't know everything about my husband." That night, Helen crept back upstairs. As she passed the study, she noticed a light still glowing under the door. She pressed her ear gently to the wood. "Just need a few more signatures. Once that clause is sealed, we're clear," someone said. Helen's blood ran cold. The next morning, she searched the garage for old files. Gerald had always been old school. He kept backups. In an old metal box beneath gardening gloves and an ancient baseball mitt, she found photocopies of property records, handwritten notes, and something else. A photograph. It was of Gerald decades ago, standing beside a much younger man, Kurt. Helen's breath caught. She turned it over. G with KL, 1992. Don't trust this one. L, Lillian, her sister. What had she meant? Helen's hands trembled. She hadn't spoken to Lillian in 30 years. Not since the blowout over Gerald's estate. They'd both said unforgivable things. But suddenly, her sister's name came roaring back into her thoughts like a lifeline thrown across stormy waters. Then, another twist. She opened the trash bin in the kitchen late one night looking for a misdelivered letter, and found something else, a crumpled pregnancy test box. Positive. Rachel hadn't said a word. Helen's mind spiraled. Was Rachel pregnant again? Was that why she was tolerating Kurt's control, why she was helping cover up whatever Kurt was doing? Or was the pregnancy a lie, a manipulation, just like the baby used to push Helen out of the guest room? Helen no longer knew who her daughter was. That night, as she lay curled on the cot, garage door sealed shut, she realized the fear wasn't just about being pushed aside. It was about being silenced, erased. There were locked drawers, disappearing documents, strange visitors, and now a photograph tying Kurt to her late husband, years before Rachel even met him. Rachel wasn't cold anymore, she was scared. Helen clutched the photo to her chest and whispered, "Lillian, I need you." Helen stared at the photo for the third night in a row, the old garage light flickering above her like a nervous pulse. Gerald and Kurt. 1992. Don't trust this one. L. The handwriting hadn't changed. Lillian's pen always slanted right, just like her spine when she was angry, which was often. They hadn't spoken in 27 years. Not since the fight over the cabin. Not since the funeral where Lillian whispered, "You married the wrong Morrison?" before storming off with half the inheritance paperwork in her purse. Helen stared at the phone. Her finger hovered over the contacts app, then drew back. But what else could she do? She tapped the name Lillian Blake and let it ring. It picked up on the 5th chime. A crackle. Then a voice that hadn't aged a day. I wondered how long it would take. Helen's breath caught. Lillian. A beat. Then. I assume you found the photo. Helen's spine stiffened. How did you? I put it in the box after the funeral. Gerald's office was never as private as he thought. A pause. Why are you calling, Helen? Out of guilt? Or because your golden girl has finally turned? Helen nearly hung up. But then she heard something strange in her sister's voice. Not mockery, not triumph, caution. Because I'm scared, Helen admitted. Because Rachel's not herself. And Kurt is hiding something. I think it's connected to Gerald. And you. There was silence on the line. Then a sigh. Where are you? The garage. Figures. 2 hours later, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Helen peered through the slats of the garage door as a tall, sharp-featured woman stepped out, trench coat, combat boots, and a face carved from old grievances. Lillian hadn't aged the way Helen had. She wore bitterness like armor. You look like hell, Lillian said as Helen opened the door. I sleep next to a lawnmower. They stood for a moment. 2 women, 2 decades of silence, and too many words left unsaid. Finally, Lillian reached into her coat and pulled out a flash drive. This has copies of everything Gerald filed the year he updated the will. I kept it for leverage, just in case. You spied on him? Lillian's eyes gleamed. He used my law office for the revisions. You think I wouldn't check what my brother-in-law was planning? Helen felt the floor shift beneath her. Why? Why didn't you ever tell me? Because you picked him over me, over the truth. You always did. Helen looked away. He was my husband. And Kurt? Lillian asked. Was he ever your son-in-law, or something else entirely? That night they sat on milk crates, sifting through files and memories. Lillian opened a folder. Kurt Lachlan. Changed his name in 1995. Before that, he was Kevin Granger. Ring a bell? Helen froze. Gerald had a brief mentorship, a troubled boy. Gerald said he dropped out of the program. He didn't drop out, Lillian said. He was removed after accusations of forgery. Embezzlement. Gerald covered it up quietly. I found a sealed settlement. Gerald paid the boy's foster family to stay quiet. Helen's stomach churned. So Kurt Kevin came back? Lillian nodded. He's been planning this for years. The house, the will, Rachel, all of it. A slow con. But why Rachel? Why marry her? To get to you. Or maybe to get back at Gerald. Or, she hesitated, maybe because Rachel reminds him of someone else. Helen swallowed hard. He's hurting her. I can see it in her eyes. Then we have to move fast, Lillian said. There's a clause in the original will. One Gerald never filed, but I have a copy. It places the house in a protected trust, contingent on you remaining a resident until death or voluntary relocation. If it was forged or filed without that clause, someone tampered. Helen's mind reeled. Rachel filed the new deed. She's in on it, Lillian said flatly. No, Helen insisted. She's scared. She's not capable of something like this. Lillian didn't argue. But her silence said enough. Before they left the garage, Helen opened a shoebox tucked beneath an old quilt. Inside was the one thing she'd never told anyone she kept, a letter from Gerald dated 2 days before his death. If anything happens to me, protect Rachel. She doesn't know the whole truth about him, but Lillian does. And one day, you'll have to choose between what you want to believe and what's really in front of you. Helen handed it over. Lillian read it, blinked. He knew. And now we do, Helen said. What do we do next? Lillian stood, gathering the files. Now, we go to war. But as Helen stepped back inside the garage, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The door to her storage cabinet was open. Papers missing. Someone had been down here. Someone had listened. And someone didn't want this war to happen. The next morning, Lillian was already pacing in Helen's garage, now transformed into a war room. Boxes of documents were stacked like sandbags. The air smelled of mildew, coffee, and revelation. Helen held a yellowed legal envelope with shaking fingers. Lillian had retrieved it from a storage unit 2 counties over, buried beneath old tax returns and divorce decrees from her days as a practicing lawyer, stamped in fading ink. Confidential, Morrison Estate, Revision 1997, unfiled. You're not going to like this, Lillian warned. Helen braced herself. Try me. Lillian pulled out a stapled packet, flipped to a notarized clause halfway through. Gerald wrote a supplemental trust revision in 1997. It was never officially filed with the county, meaning it's not legally binding. But look at this. She pointed to a paragraph. In the event of my death, the family home located at 114 Beechwood Lane shall remain in Helen Morrison's name in perpetuity unless her mental or physical state renders continued residence unsafe. Under no circumstance may this asset be transferred or sold without the joint consent of both Helen Morrison and Lillian Blake. Helen's heart dropped. Why include you? Because he knew Rachel was too soft and you were too trusting. She paused. He never wanted Kurt, Kevin, anywhere near it. This was a safeguard. But Rachel signed over the deed herself, Helen whispered, which means this clause was removed. Lillian nodded grimly. Which means someone forged or doctored the will after Gerald's death. I bet the official copy at the courthouse is missing this clause entirely. And if that's true, then you never legally gave the house away. Because you never had the legal authority to in the first place. Helen sat down hard on the garage bench. Her head spun. She remembered signing the paperwork with Rachel just a year after Gerald passed. The lawyer had been someone Kurt recommended. Friendly, young, too eager. She thought it was a formality. A family gesture. It had been a theft. That afternoon, Lillian suggested they visit the county records office in person. Rachel was out, likely running errands, but Kurt's car remained ominously parked in the driveway. They left unnoticed. At the courthouse, the clerk retrieved the will on file. Lillian skimmed it with a tight jaw. Exactly what I thought. No mention of the protective clause. The entire trust is missing. Helen's throat tightened. It's like Gerald's final wishes were erased. But then, a twist. Lillian asked to see the witness affidavits attached to the will. 2 names were listed. The first was expected. The attorney Kurt brought in. The second stopped both women cold. Rachel Morrison. She witnessed the will, Helen said aloud, stunned. Or pretended to, Lillian muttered. That signature looks off. And if she was complicit, we're in deeper than we thought. Back at the house, Helen waited until nightfall. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did the need for answers. She knocked on Rachel's bedroom door. When no answer came, she opened it. The room was pristine. Too pristine. Rachel had always been messy. Books askew, clothes in piles. Now, the books were alphabetized, the drawers too orderly. It smelled faintly of lavender and fear. Helen knelt near the dresser. One drawer was locked. She pulled gently. No give. Then she remembered. Years ago, Gerald had hidden a universal key to the house's antique locks behind the baseboard heater. She found it still there. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside, a file folder, a flash drive, and an envelope addressed to Mom. Helen opened it. If you're reading this, I couldn't stop him. I never wanted you in the garage. I thought I could fix it before it got worse. I thought I could protect you and him. But I was wrong. There's a document inside this drawer. The real will, the one Gerald gave me to keep hidden. I didn't know what it meant until it was too late. By the time I understood, the fake one was already filed. He threatened to destroy it. I copied it just in case. I'm so sorry. Rachel, Helen's hands trembled. She took the flash drive, the folder, and the letter, and fled the room just in time to hear the front door open. Kurt. His voice boomed in the hall. Rachel, where have you been? Helen ducked into the garage, heart hammering. She placed the evidence in a sealed storage bin beneath a stack of broken Christmas lights. Later, she and Lillian examined the contents. The flash drive had digital scans of the original will, with the trust clause intact. The folder contained Kurt's fake legal identity, complete with a doctored birth certificate, social security number, and employment history. This, Lillian said, holding up the documents, is enough to sink him. But Rachel, Helen murmured, why stay silent all this time? She may be caught in a deeper net than we thought, Lillian said. As if on cue, Helen's phone buzzed. A text. From Rachel. We need to talk. Not here. Somewhere safe. Helen sat in the corner booth of the old roadside diner 2 towns over, the one with flickering neon, greasy menus, and bad coffee that tasted like burned truth. She hadn't stepped foot in this place in over 20 years. The air buzzed with country music and the clink of chipped mugs. Her eyes flicked to the door every few seconds. Then Rachel walked in. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky, a hoodie zipped to her chin, and walked with a stiffness that didn't come from the cold. When she spotted Helen, she hesitated, just for a second before crossing the floor. She slid into the booth, silent. You chose this place, Helen said softly. No one from his world would think to look for me here. Helen blinked. His world? Rachel didn't answer immediately. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside were faded photographs, receipts, and a scratched locket. She dropped it all on the table. "Do you remember Daniel?" Rachel asked. Helen furrowed her brow. "Your old high school boyfriend?" "The one who disappeared," Rachel finished. Kevin was his roommate back then. Daniel got me involved in something stupid, some identity loan scam. Nothing major, just school IDs and student loans under fake names. Kurt helped him. He was always persuasive. Helen stared at her. "You never told me this." "I was 17. And scared. After Daniel vanished, Kurt kept showing up. I thought he was protecting me." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out he was watching me, waiting, grooming me. He didn't even change his name until years later. But by then, I was already tied to him in ways I couldn't undo." Helen leaned in. "Is that why you let him move in? Why you changed around Gerald's will?" Rachel looked down. "It started with pressure, then blackmail, then threats. He knew about the fake student loans, the embezzled tuition funds from my old job, things that could land me in prison. He said if I didn't help him change the deed, he'd make sure I lost everything." Helen's voice trembled. "You watched me sleep in a garage, Rachel. I thought it would be temporary. I thought if I played along, I could fix it from the inside." Her voice cracked. "He watched me like a hawk, took over my emails, tapped the house phone. Mom, he used my fingerprints to unlock the family's safe. I haven't felt like myself in years." Helen's heart broke, and yet fury licked at its edges. "You still lied in court." "I had to." Rachel glanced around. "He said if I didn't, he'd release the footage, the one from 2016. Helen's blood chilled. "What footage?" Rachel hesitated. "There was an accident. A neighbor's child. I was babysitting. He fell off the stairs and broke his arm, but it looked worse. Looked like neglect. It wasn't, I swear. But Kurt filmed it without me knowing. Then edited it to look like abuse. He's kept it all these years. Says if I turn on him, he'll leak it anonymously. No one will believe me, not after everything else." Helen sat in stunned silence. She thought she had been the only one crushed under Kurt's weight. But Rachel had been suffocating silently all along. Then Rachel dropped the final bombshell. "He's working with someone, that mysterious benefactor who posted his bail? It's someone in the family." Helen's head snapped up. "Who?" "I don't know, but I overheard him call someone after the fire. He said, 'She's getting too close. You said this would be easy.' Then he said your name, Mom," and laughed. Lillian's words from the night before echoed in Helen's ears. Who else has a stake in keeping the truth buried? Rachel looked over at her. "He's planning something. I don't know what, but I heard him on the phone again this morning. He said if you find the original will, he'll take it to the grave with her." Helen's spine stiffened. "He's planning to hurt me." "I don't know how far he'll go," Rachel whispered, "but if we're going to stop him, we need more than evidence. We need leverage." Helen reached into her coat pocket and placed a copy of the flash drive on the table. "This is the real will. And your confession," she said. "It's enough to bury him." Rachel swallowed. "Not unless we expose everything. Publicly. No backroom settlements. No hush money." Helen nodded slowly. "I want to help," Rachel added. "I owe you that." Helen looked into her daughter's eyes. There was something new there. Not just guilt or pain. Resolve. "We're going to need Lillian," Helen said. Rachel exhaled. "Then we better move fast. Because Kurt's already planning his next move." And somewhere, deep inside the house Helen had once called a sanctuary, Kurt was watching. Listening. And smiling. It began with the attic. Lillian had insisted they search it, though Helen hadn't been up there in years. Dusty boxes, yellowing wallpaper samples, and forgotten holiday decorations cluttered the space. But Lillian was methodical. She combed through each container like a prosecutor with a hostile witness. "There," she said finally, pointing to a cedar chest buried beneath old quilts. Inside was a thick, locked binder labeled, Property and Estate Morrison. Helen felt her stomach drop. That was Gerald's, she murmured. I thought it was destroyed when we redid the den. Lillian picked the lock with an old hairpin in under a minute. Old habits die hard. Inside were photocopies of deeds, letters from the family lawyer, and most damning of all, a faded copy of a handwritten codicil to Gerald's will. It explicitly mentioned a contingency clause in the event of contested ownership and named Helen as the sole trustee of the home until her death. This trumps the deed transfer, Lillian muttered. If we can prove the transfer to Rachel was done under false pretenses, especially with Kurt involved, it'll collapse in court. Helen's hands trembled. You think this is what he's been after all along? No doubt about it. Lillian stared at the codicil. And if this clause ever sees daylight, it won't just ruin Kurt. It'll implicate whoever helped forge the other documents too. Helen looked at her sister. You mean someone in the family? Lillian didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. That night, Helen crept out to the garage, where she still slept, though now only to keep up appearances while she and Rachel secretly coordinated their moves. The space was colder than usual, and something felt off. The air smelled faintly of gasoline. A folded note had been slipped under her mattress. Stay silent, or the next fire won't be a warning. Helen's pulse quickened. She scrambled back into the house and shook Rachel awake. He knows we're getting close, Rachel nodded. He's been edgy, drinking more. And there's someone else. He's meeting with a woman. I only caught a glimpse of her. Short blonde hair, drives a black Jag. I think she's paying him. Helen frowned. Any idea who she is? Rachel hesitated. She looked familiar. By dawn, they had a plan. Lillian would secure the documents in a safety deposit box. Rachel would try to identify the mysterious woman. Helen would search the basement, where Gerald once kept a safe embedded in the foundation, a place not even Kurt knew existed. But Kurt wasn't as unaware as they thought. 2 days later, Helen returned from a grocery run to find smoke billowing from the garage, flames licked at the corners. A neighbor had already called the fire department, but by the time Helen reached the driveway, it was too late. The garage was engulfed. The same neighbor shouted, "We thought you were inside!" Helen, shaken, looked at the scorched remains of her makeshift bed. If she'd come home 10 minutes earlier, Lillian arrived moments later, breathless. That wasn't an accident. I know, Helen whispered. The police investigated, but with no cameras and no witnesses, they couldn't press charges. Still, Helen filed a report and mentioned Kurt by name. He'll lawyer up, Lillian warned, but even if we can't get him for arson, we can hit him with fraud, elder abuse, coercion. They didn't expect what came next. 2 days after the fire, Kurt was arrested. Not for the blaze, but for fraud linked to forged employment documents from his previous identity. Someone had tipped off the state attorney. He was released within 24 hours. Bail posted by a private party. The name on the receipt? Margot Winters. Helen dropped the paper when she saw it. Lillian's eyes narrowed. That's Gerald's old secretary. Helen blinked. Margot was loyal. She loved Gerald. She never even liked Kurt. She also knew about the estate plans, Lillian said darkly, and she disappeared right after Gerald's funeral, remember? Rachel, listening from the kitchen, stepped forward. I remember her. She used to whisper things to Dad when she thought I wasn't listening. Once, I heard her say, "The girl can't know the truth." Not yet. I thought she meant me being adopted. You're not adopted, Helen snapped. Rachel stared at her. Then what truth? A long silence fell over the room. Lillian was the one to break it. Whatever Margot's connection is, she's pulling strings from the shadows. And we need to find out why. If she's funding Kurt, this is bigger than just greed or revenge. Helen nodded slowly. We find Margot, we find the motive. That night, Helen returned to the smoldering ruins of the garage with a flashlight and gloves. As she sifted through the ash, her fingers brushed something metallic beneath the blackened concrete. A fireproof lockbox, miraculously intact. Inside, another copy of Gerald's will, and beneath it, a sealed envelope addressed to "My daughter Rachel in the event of my death." Helen stared at it, heart pounding. The truth wasn't just buried in walls or fire. It was in blood. And it was about to rewrite everything. The courtroom was packed. Press, family friends, legal aides, and a handful of curious locals drawn in by the scandalous headlines. Widow's home stolen in forgery scandal. Estranged husband, secret benefactor involved. What they didn't know was that what would unfold inside that wood-paneled chamber would be far more shocking than any newspaper could print. Lillian wore a navy blue suit sharp enough to cut glass, and her presence at Helen's side immediately shifted the tone of the room. Though no longer officially licensed, she'd coached Helen's attorney meticulously. Every question, every objection, every exhibit, they were all weapons in a war she'd spent her whole life preparing to fight. Kurt sat smugly across the aisle, flanked by a sleek lawyer in a $4,000 suit, and Margot Winters, who didn't so much as glance at Helen when they locked eyes. The early testimony centered on paperwork, forged deeds, suspicious power of attorney documents, and notarized forms bearing Helen's signature, even though she'd never signed them. Then Lillian stood up with her trump card. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to submit a piece of recovered audiovisual evidence. A security tape, dated nearly 8 years ago." Kurt paled. His attorney immediately objected. "That footage is ancient. The chain of custody is unclear." "It was retrieved from the safe of the late Gerald Morrison," Lillian interrupted coolly. "Unaltered, sealed, and verified by a third-party digital forensic analyst. All documentation has been submitted to the clerk." The judge overruled the objection. The courtroom dimmed. The footage crackled to life on the screen. In grainy black and white, a younger Kurt appeared, seated at Gerald Morrison's desk. He looked over his shoulder once, then lifted a pen. Methodically, he began signing documents, Helen's name over and over again. Then he took out a rubber stamp and applied a fake notary seal. But it was what happened next that drew audible gasps. A woman entered the frame, Margot Winters. She handed Kurt a folder and whispered, "Once this is filed, she'll never know." The screen went dark. The silence in the courtroom was thunderous. Helen sat frozen. She hadn't expected Margot to be in the tape. The judge called a recess. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps. Inside, chaos unfolded in hushed tones. Margot's lawyer tried to strike a deal, lesser charges in exchange for a private settlement. Lillian refused. But the true earthquake came when Rachel was called to testify. She walked in wearing all black. Her eyes were bloodshot. She refused to meet her mother's gaze. "Rachel Morrison," the attorney began, "were you aware that your husband forged legal documents relating to your mother's home?" Rachel hesitated. Then, softly, "No." Lillian's jaw twitched. "Are you aware now, having seen the footage?" Rachel's lips trembled. "That doesn't look like Kurt," murmurs erupted. Lillian stood. "Permission to cross-examine." The judge nodded. Lillian approached the stand slowly, as if drawing back a curtain. "You're protecting him," she said plainly. Rachel blinked back tears. "I'm telling the truth." "No, you're not. You've known for years. Why lie now? What does he have over you?" Rachel was silent. Her hand clenched the wooden railing. Lillian leaned in. "Or, is it not him you're protecting at all?" Rachel's lower lip quivered. "I'm going to ask one more time, under oath. Why are you lying to protect the man who forged your mother's signature and tried to burn her alive?" Rachel looked down. And then, finally, spoke. "Because he's my brother." The entire courtroom gasped. Even Kurt sat motionless, eyes wide. Helen's vision blurred. "No," she whispered. Rachel nodded slowly, as if every movement cost her strength. "My father, Gerald, had an affair with Margot. Kurt was the result. I found out when I was 15. I hated it. I hated him. But then, she looked at Kurt, almost mournfully. We reconnected as adults. I thought if I kept him close, I could fix it. Fix him, fix everything. Lillian stepped back in disbelief. You married your half-brother. Rachel nodded again. I didn't know when we started dating. When I found out, I tried to leave. But he threatened to expose me. Things I did in college, debts I'd forged in Mom's name, the loan I took out behind her back. Helen stared at her daughter, this broken, scared woman who had once been her everything, and realized she didn't know her at all. The trial paused as the judge called a private review of new evidence. Outside, the press now had enough fuel to burn for weeks. Helen sat on the bench in the hallway, Lillian beside her. Neither spoke. Then Rachel emerged from the courtroom, face pale. I never meant to hurt you, she said softly. Helen looked up. Her voice came out hoarse. You already did, Rachel swallowed. But you could still take it all from us. You could win this case. Helen looked at her daughter for a long, long moment. Then she said, That depends. On what? Helen stood, gathering her coat. On whether you're worth saving. The courtroom smelled of dust and tension. It had been a week since Rachel's confession, a week since Helen had sat silently on that wooden bench while her daughter revealed the darkest truth of all, that she had married her own half-brother. That Kurt, the man who stole Helen's home, her dignity, nearly her life, was also the flesh and blood of Helen's late husband, and that Rachel had known all along. Helen hadn't returned to the stand since. She hadn't responded to reporters. She hadn't spoken to Rachel. She simply vanished into Lillian's downtown condo and stopped answering the door. But today she was back. As the judge entered, the courtroom rose. Helen remained still for a second longer than the others, then slowly stood. Her movements were deliberate, poised. She had made her decision. Before we proceed with final statements, her attorney announced, Mrs. Morrison would like to address the court directly. There was a buzz of murmurs. Kurt didn't blink. Rachel, seated beside him now, looked down at her lap as if bracing for execution. Helen stepped up to the podium, a stack of papers in hand. I won't take much of your time, she began, voice calm but resonant. When I signed over my house to my daughter, I believed it was an act of love. I believed I was giving her security, stability, and the same sense of home my husband and I tried to build for her. She paused, eyes scanning the room. But instead of comfort, that house became a prison, not just for me, but I believe now for all of us. My daughter was trapped in secrets she never had the tools to escape. My husband trapped us all with what he kept hidden, and Kurt, well, he's tried to trap this entire family in fear. She laid the papers down on the podium. This is my final act as owner of 142 Maplehurst Avenue. Gasps whispered through the crowd as Helen's lawyer unfolded the top sheet. It's a transfer of deed, Helen continued. Effective immediately, I am donating the property and all its contents to an organization called Haven's Gate, a women's shelter that specializes in supporting survivors of domestic manipulation, elder abuse, and housing insecurity. Kurt stood up so fast his chair skidded. You can't do that! That house is still under legal dispute! Helen turned to face him. No, Kurt, it's not. Not anymore. Because I'm not fighting for it. He froze. You tried to destroy me in that garage. But all you did was burn what was already broken. You want that house? Take it. It's hollow now, stripped of everything that mattered. But you'll never profit from it. She turned back to the judge. Let the world see this for what it was, a tragedy built on secrets. But I won't be complicit in prolonging it. Rachel began to sob. Kurt sat slowly, lips tight, but Lillian stood, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. Your Honor, she said, I have one last piece of evidence to admit into the record. All eyes turned to her. She held up a yellowed envelope, its seal unbroken. This letter was written by Gerald Morrison before his death and entrusted to a private firm. It was to be delivered to Helen only if legal proceedings ever involved the ownership of their home. The judge nodded for her to proceed. Lillian handed the envelope to the clerk, who opened it and read aloud. In Gerald's hand, to Helen and our daughter. If this letter finds you in court, it means I failed in ways I never intended. I loved you both. But years ago, I made a choice I could never undo. I fathered a son outside our marriage. I never told you because I was ashamed. When Margot came to me, I offered her money to keep quiet. But I also left something else, a trust, under Rachel's name, meant to one day provide for him. I never meant for the two of them to meet, much less marry. If I had known... God forgive me. The house should always belong to you, Helen. Not for legal reasons, but because it was your soul that made it a home. If it's ever in dispute, please, do what you think is right. Gerald? Helen closed her eyes. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Rachel sobbed openly. Kurt just sat, stunned, the cracks in his expression finally showing. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Morrison, are you certain you wish to proceed with your donation of the property? Helen nodded once. Yes, I'm done fighting for bricks. I'm going to fight for peace. Outside the courthouse, reporters descended, but Helen pushed through them with Lillian at her side. As the doors shut behind them, Helen stopped and turned. I lost my family, she said to no one in particular, but maybe I can help someone else rebuild theirs. Later that week, as movers emptied the house and Havens Gate volunteers painted over old walls, Helen watched from across the street. She carried nothing with her, no boxes, no bitterness. Rachel had left a voicemail. I'm sorry, I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm sorry. Helen didn't call back. Not yet. But she saved the message, and when the first family moved into the house, a mother with 2 young daughters who had escaped their own kind of darkness, Helen left one thing behind in the attic, a handwritten note. This house tried to break me. Now, I hope it will shelter you. Helen Morrison,